My name's Rich Harrington for Understanding Adobe Photoshop. Today, let's explore the many preferences that you have to control how Photoshop CS5 behaves. Preferences are user-controlled options that change default behaviors in a program. They often help you set up the program to work more like you think, and there are a lot of fine controls available. Let's explore. Once you've launched Photoshop, you can click Photoshop and choose Preferences General. If you're using a PC, you'll find that under the File menu. The shortcut is just Command or Control K. Now, this brings up the Preferences dialog. And let's do a quick overview of some of the most important ones. There's a lot of options here, so we can't go through all of them, but there are some that I highly recommend you tweak. First off is the color picker. It's a great idea to stick with the defaults of the Adobe Color Picker, which is going to give you an easy-to-use color tool for switching between colors. Next is image interpolation. This deals with what happens when you change the image's size. By default, it's set to bicubic, which is a general way that is a high-quality scale. If you find yourself frequently enlarging or reducing images, however, you can go ahead and change the default to bicubic smoother or bicubic sharper. In this day and age, you'll rarely use nearest neighbor or the bilinear because computers have gotten pretty fast. But those methods are good if you have to have a really fast resize, but you will lose some image quality. Going on through, there's lots of other options here. One of the ones that annoys me is the Shift key for tool switch. I recommend that you uncheck that so you can go ahead and quickly switch between tools with keyboard shortcuts. I do, however, like to use the zoom on the scroll wheel mouse so I could zoom in and out using the mouse. This means that you could simply roll the scroll wheel forward or back, or if using a touch surface mouse, just move the finger up and down to zoom in while working in an image. Going on through, I take advantage of flick panning, which lets us quickly move around an image just by panning and quickly using the cursor of the mouse. And we can go ahead and place images as smart objects. We'll talk about smart objects in a later lesson, but they are really useful, and I highly recommend you leave this checked by default. To go on to the next category, we'll just click Next. And this is the user interface. Now, you don't want to change too many things in here. This will let us work with the same sort of looking Photoshop. But one of the things that is important is never turn on Show Channels in Color. You learned in an earlier lesson that channels are the individual components of color. Well, seeing those as grayscale images makes it a lot easier to understand the presence of color. And as we start to do advanced color correction, it'll become necessary to see that detail. If you use a trackpad, you may want to disable Enable Gestures. Some people find it useful to be able to use the gestures on the trackpad for zooming and panning. However, personally, I often find that they get in the way. It might be because I have big fingers, but for most users, it seems the popular option is actually turn this off. Going on through, you have control over the user interface language if you have multiple languages installed, and you could change the size of the font. Typically, I'll go with medium, which will boost up the size of elements in the user interface. This makes it a lot easier to see what's going on when using a high-resolution monitor. You can click Next. Our next area is how files should be handled when you open and close them, saving your documents. There are some options here that will just make it easier to store your digital files. One of the things I recommend is saving image previews. This makes it a lot easier when browsing to tell what your photos are. I also always append the file extension. This places the proper 2 or 3 letter code after the file name and ensures compatibility, especially if you're going to be moving them over the internet or over a network to other users. It's quite possible for files to become corrupt without their extension. Down here, I choose to save as to the original folder. That makes it easier to pick the same destination, and everything else should be fine. If you have a lot of files open, you might find it useful to change the recent file list. This means when you click on the File menu and choose Open Recent, you could see more documents listed. Let's go to Performance, and here we can allocate how much RAM is available to Photoshop. Adobe Photoshop CS5 is a 64-bit application. This means it runs natively on OS 10.6 or later on a Mac, or that you need a 64-bit version of Windows Vista or Windows 7 in order to use it. The greatest benefit of 64-bit operating systems is that the previous 3 GB cap for RAM has been lifted. You can in fact access a lot more memory on your computer. Essentially, it's 3 GB per core, so if you have an 8-core machine, you can have up to 24 GB of RAM assigned just to Photoshop. Now, chances are you'll never need that much RAM, but being able to assign more than 3 GB is actually quite useful. You'll see control for that here, and you can assign a preference of how much Photoshop is allowed to use, and you see it gives you a recommendation for a range based upon what's installed. Follow that ideal range recommendation. You can also assign scratch disks to improve performance. The scratch disk is where Photoshop turns for virtual memory, and this will help you when doing very complex tasks like a resize of a large digital file. Everything else ties into your history states. This is your levels of undo. You can expand that to a higher number for more levels of undo. And you've got control over how the video card is used, including advanced settings for what sort of performance you want. And this will give you the most amount of memory performance given towards Photoshop tasks. There we go. Moving on to the next tab is cursors. Now, cursors are how Photoshop gives you interaction about which tool you're using. By default, I recommend using the normal brush tip, but seeing a crosshair to make it easier to know where you're clicking. You're going to find that this is more useful when you start to paintbrush, so you know where the brush is going. On the other hand, I do not recommend using cute cursor icons. If you are using the eyedropper tool to sample a color, it's much more useful to use a precise cursor so you know exactly where the sampling is occurring. Let's go on to the next tab, Transparency and Gamut, and this tab can be pretty much left alone. On to Units and Rulers. Here you describe how to measure your graphics. If you do a lot of work for print, you'll probably leave this set to inches. On the other hand, if you're doing work for the web or video, you'll probably choose to measure in pixels. Our next tab, Guides, Grids, and Slices, gives us color. This is up to you, but this makes it easier for alignment. Plugins give you some control over other options like where third-party plugins are stored if you want to have a second plugins folder. We'll discuss plugins later. The next category is type, and this is important. I recommend choosing font preview size and setting that up big enough. In most cases, large is very easy to read, but if you're doing design with a group, maybe a client sitting over your shoulder, you could switch that to extra large or, of course, huge to make it easier to see your font preview. One other option is smart quotes, and this gives you true quotation marks, and we'll explore this later when we look at type. The last option is 3D, and this is going to only be available when working with Photoshop Extended. Photoshop Extended has a lot of controls for designing 3D type and working with 3D objects and models. This is where you control RAM and general performance. Now, unless you're doing a lot of 3D, you could pretty much ignore this tab, and when you're first getting started, I recommend the default values. They're going to work very well for most users. When you're all set, you can go ahead and click OK, and the preferences are stored. Now, Photoshop offers a lot of control. You're going to want to explore those preferences, and remember, you can come back at any time and make a tweak. Some of the recommendations I gave you are my own personal preference, but are based upon years of using Adobe Photoshop. Be sure to tweak the settings to your liking and explore all the options available to you.